Welcome to Inviting Oneness, a podcast where we explore true personal stories from friends and members of EquaSion. Stories where the illusion of separateness gave way to the deeper truth of our shared humanity. Oneness isn't an idea, it's an experience. And today, we continue listening for it, one story at a time. My guest today is Dr. John O'Keefe. John is the director of the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier University and is a new board member at EquaSion. Here's John.
The question of when I've experienced oneness is interesting. I do experience that fairly frequently in the context of meditation, but the story that comes to mind for the purposes of this interview is some years ago, more than 10, I think 10 or 12 years ago, I had the chance to go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo for 3 weeks, and I was working on a documentary project there, and it was a very remote village in the middle of the Congo that was extremely hard to get to. It was a multi-day journey. It involved Land Rovers through bush with barely any roads. It involved crossing rivers and dugout canoes and finally getting to our destination. But there was one particular day we went to Mass, and it was on a Sunday liturgy, and the liturgy was 3 hours long, and it was extremely intense. There was dancing throughout. The priests and they danced on the altar. There were altar girls dancing. There were altar boys dancing. The congregation was dancing. During the offertory, people, instead of bringing up money, they brought up like goats and chickens and food. And even though this liturgy lasted for 3 hours, it really felt to me like an extended experience of communion where everybody in that room on that day at that time was together for just a single moment in time. It was extremely cool.
It was striking to me the way you described the journey to get to this place. And I know that a core spiritual practice that happens within a lot of world traditions, but especially within the Catholic Church, is this practice of pilgrimage. Would you describe this experience as a pilgrimage of sorts?
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't really thought of it that way because I was going for the purpose of making a short documentary about the ministry of a Catholic bishop in the remote Congo. And we were there at his invitation. But it was, in a way, a spiritual journey. I mean, it was fairly risky to go to the Congo. I mean, when I think about all of the travels I've done in my life, and I've been a lot of places, this is absolutely the most dangerous place I've ever gone. So there was a kind of risk taking involved, a kind of pilgrimage into being, trusting in the people who were going to host me, that they would take care of me, kind of a pilgrimage of trust in a way. So even though I haven't really thought of that particular trip as a pilgrimage, I think that the word is not inappropriate.
The other thing that you talked about was this extended experience of communion where 3 hours felt like a moment. This reminds me of Kairos time and Chronos time. Maybe you could introduce us a little bit to those concepts and how that played out in your experience.
Well, the Chronos time is the normal time that we experience where, sequential time where this moment follows the next moment. The moment we're in follows the one that just passed and immediately disappears into the one that's coming. So there's this kind of sequential aspect to it. The Kairos time is more this sense that a lot of religious traditions talk about, although they use different languages to describe it, where time really almost disappears and you only have an experience of presence and the eternal as a kind of unending expanse of nowness. And St. Augustine used to talk about this as, that's the normal state of human beings. It's only in the fallen state that we experience a sequential time where we're actually alienated from the possibility of being and having real presence and really being in the presence of God because of the passage of time. So there's a way in which the aspiration, the desire, the hope for is an eternity to kind of rest in that eternal presence.
And in the context of your contemplative practice independent of this liturgical experience, it would be interesting for me to hear, how do you experience time in the context of that practice? Because I know that we often think of time and the way that a sequentially clock ticks from 1 second to the next as kind of basic reality, but I don't know if that's necessarily true, especially in the context of contemplative practice.
Well, I think in contemplative practice, you can kind of slip in and out of these two dimensions of temporal experience. I think like most meditators, there are plenty of days when I'm just painfully aware of the clock and just feel like, it's never going to end. Just my mind wanders, my back is itching, or, I just can't sit still. I can't actually stop the monkey mind kind of idea flow. But there are other times, and this happens with some regularity, where the sort of sequential nature of time just stops and recedes. And you're just sort of there, present on the cushion, breathing in and out, and being in the presence of the infinite. And I think that the more you practice contemplative prayer and do contemplative practice, the more you kind of slip into that with less effort. And that's why I think they call it a practice, because it is something that one can cultivate.
The other thing in your story that struck me was how much dancing was happening. And I think that one thing that we've seen in the stories that we've heard in this podcast is that sometimes this ecstatic nature is an important part of the experience of oneness. I'm not sure that you were dancing along with them, but perhaps you were. How would you connect ecstaticism with the experience of oneness in your own lived experience?
I guess I'm not sure exactly what you mean by ecstatic. I mean, there's you can think of like the statue of Saint Teresa of Avila in ecstasy that's in Rome, the sort of classic Bernini sculpture. But there's also kind of, sometimes people talk about Pentecostal kind of people getting really worked up into religious frenzies as experiencing moments of ecstatic kind of behavior. So I guess I'm a little cautious with the word ecstatic. I wouldn't describe the liturgical experience in the Congo as ecstatic in that way. I mean, the liturgy that I went to it's part of a tradition that exists really only in the Congo called the Zaire liturgy. And it was a liturgical adaptation that happened after the Second Vatican Council, specifically in Africa, as a way of kind of incorporating indigenous African practices into Catholic practice. So the dancing and the kind of celebration that was there is not, it wasn't abnormal. It was really something that was part of the African culture already. So my dancing in that context, it was basically swaying back and forth. I wasn't sort of jumping up and down or doing anything that would resemble kind of unusual ecstatic experiences.
I love the idea. When I think about liturgical innovation, what comes to my mind is really cool written words, change in the vernacular, maybe something like that. But I like the idea that the specific liturgical formulation that you were partaking in explicitly incorporated dance. I can imagine like us holding our liturgical kind of sheet and saying, "Oh, now it's time to dance." And I think that's a thing that feels very countercultural for a lot of Western forms of Christianity, right?
Well, it is countercultural for Western forms of Christianity, and I think whenever I experience liturgical dance or efforts to incorporate liturgical dance in Western tradition, and it always feels a little weird, right? And I mean, the difference with the Congo was it wasn't weird at all because, as I said a minute ago, this is just part of the culture, and the liturgy was sort of adapted to the culture that was already there. On the other hand, in the American context, I've had these kinds of liturgical experiences too, but not with dancing and things like that. But it's more when the people leading the liturgy, the presider and the people in the liturgy, the congregation really understand each other. And they're sort of in this back and forth ritual dance that is really quite amazing when it's working. And that can have a similar kind of a result of creating a felt experience of oneness among the people who are involved in that. And that has happened to me many, many times in the American context over the last, 40 years.
The other question that's coming up from me is that you talked about the pilgrimage that you went on, kind of reframing your experience through that as a pilgrimage of risk and trust. And I think the experience of oneness within kind of the Christian perspective also has some assumptions and theological claims about the source of oneness, maybe the source of all. I just wonder, how would you connect this idea of risk and trust with your conception of the divine?
Recently, I've been thinking about the Irish concept of thin places, and the idea that there are places in the world where the sort of distance between this world and the divine world it's not very thick. There's this Irish proverb that says the distance between heaven and earth is only about 30 feet, and in thin places it's even closer. There's this idea that somehow the divine is just ready to erupt. It's so close, right? And one of the things that can happen with, good liturgy or meditation or some kind of, or any, collective prayer is that we become more open to the proximity and the nearness of the divine. So I think that's sort of a general truth about the way the world is constructed. Now, in terms of trusting in the context of what was a risky kind of pilgrimage journey to central Congo, I mean, there is something to be said for really putting yourselves in the hands of others more than any other trip or experience in my life. That during those 3 weeks, I felt like I was really being carried by not just God, but by these people who were taking care of us, and where we had very, very little power. We were in this village that we were 7-hour Jeep ride from the nearest airport, and the only planes in and out of there were one or two flights a week. So it was pretty remote. So it just felt like a kind of an extended experience of really trusting that, I had been led there for some reason, and trusting that it was going to work out.
Had been led there for some reason. I like that. Okay, so for folks who are listening to our conversation, who've heard your story, who probably won't get the chance of going to Congo and documenting this innovative liturgy, what do you hope the invitation is that they'll receive from this story and conversation?
The reason that trip happened at all, we weren't going to document this liturgy. That wasn't the main purpose. The main purpose of the trip was to document the work of this bishop, and the liturgy just happened because we were there. And the bishop was trying to hold the world together in the context of a very long period, extended period of terrible civil violence and civil unrest and warfare inside the Congo that most people didn't know about. So, for me, I guess I would add that experience of, solidarity in the context of liturgy in the Congo, sort of spills over to my sense of solidarity with other people, right, all over the world who are similarly suffering. These experiences are not just for us to feel kind of good and pious and holy, but they can illustrate our deep communion with others and with other humans, and that we're all part of the same human community. And when millions of people around the world are suffering from, be it, locally, the suffering that's happened to migrants right now in the Middle East, the suffering that's happening to Israelis and Palestinians, and struggle to deal with that horrible conflict. All of that. If we have this experience of collective communion, then it becomes very, very painful to see that happening to other people.
Yeah, I think one of the gifts of the Christian tradition, in my estimation, is the identification of the divine with people who are hungry and thirsty and who are suffering. And this is Matthew 25. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. What I'm so impressed by in this conversation, what I'm taking away from this conversation with you, is your insistence upon locating the divine, not just as some sort of transcendent other, but as in the relationships with the people who are around us and with the people who are suffering in the world.
There's this classic tension in Christianity between immanence and transcendence, that God is absolutely the source and the foundation upon which all reality rests. But then God is also radically present in the world, right? In particular, in other people. So I think it's super important not to lose sight of that.
Thanks for joining us on Inviting Oneness, where we share real stories of connection that dissolve the illusion of separation and reveal our common humanity. To honor Chip Harrod's legacy, we invite you to invest in the Chip Harrod Transformative Dialogue Fund. EquaSion's year-end giving campaign continues to the end of December. For decades, Chip Harrod, EquaSion's founder and former executive director, brought people together across faith, race, and ideology. Chip retired this year, but EquaSion is continuing his work through the Chip Harrod Fund for Transformative Dialogue. Dialogue can give us a way forward. When we sit together, listen honestly, and share our stories, something shifts. Understanding grows, trust grows, community grows, and this is the work Chip spent his life championing, and it's the work we must continue. Until next time, may we keep inviting oneness within ourselves and with one another.